welcome to the Mona Charen Show. So glad you could join me. I'm delighted to welcome today Marc Dunkelman, who is a fellow at the Brown University Watson Institute for International and Public Affairs, formerly with the Clinton Foundation, worked on Capitol Hill for many years, and is the author of a new book, Why Nothing Works. So, Marc Dunkelman, thanks so much for joining me.
I'm so thrilled to be here. I'm excited for this conversation.
Excellent. So, this seems to be one of those moments when an idea was sort of percolating in the ether and a bunch of people all attacked it at the same time. So we have your book, we have Yoni Applebaum's Stuck, we have Abundance by Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson. All of these books are attacking a very similar theme. Do you agree that things aren't working right, and that we need to address reform efforts at the ways in which we've gone off the rails? Do you think that's roughly? Do you see yourself as part of that? And by the way, is this a situation like like Isaac Newton and Leibniz, coming up with calculus simultaneously? Or did you guys talk to each other first and say, well, I'm thinking of a book that's sort of on this topic. What about you? How did this come about?
We are all in touch.
Okay.
But it was in no way conspiratorial, and I don't even think it was even competitive. It was, I think, a joint recognition over the course of years that we on the left had participated in creating a system that wasn't actually benefiting people who believed in progressive politics. And so I think, we all come at it with slightly different lenses. I think I'm really trying to draw in historical analysis and trying to figure out how this changed and how this even relates to the beginning of progressivism in the late 19th century in ways. And Yoni has a terrific analysis of really focused on housing. And Derek and Ezra have this, have an incredible platform, but are also, sort of focused on building a different manifesto. And so I think they're all complementary, but you are right that we are in sort of a moment where I think progressivism, which ignored a lot of these issues, is really deciding to grapple with them. And a bunch of us are all trying to attack it from slightly different.
So you begin your book with an account of coming into New York's Penn Station.
Yeah.
Now, I have entered New York's Penn Station countless times in my life. I'm pretty old, but I'm not old enough to have ever experienced the previous Penn Station in New York, which was apparently this gorgeous Beaux-Arts structure with huge ceilings and light pouring in. And then it was replaced by Madison Square Garden in 1963. And they put the train station underground so that when you come in, there's that famous line about, you used to enter New York like a prince and like an emperor, and now you enter like a rat. And you described the train station as like a rat's nest.
Yeah.
So why don't we start there? Because you use this as emblematic of what's gone wrong, right?
Yeah.
So tell us about that.
So you're absolutely right. There was a beautiful station. It was considered the grandest in the world, built in the first decade of the 20th century by McKim, and White, who were the premier architects of their time. We'll have another podcast another time about why it was actually a failed building. I have a controversial view that it actually was, but certainly by the 60s, it was pretty decrepit. During the war, they had painted over the glass so that it wouldn't be a target for Nazi bombers. And then they were never able to really replace that. So there was sort of this
it was dingy
by the end, and they put in a strange ticket counter. But that's a separate podcast.
Okay.
Which I would, by the way, love to do at some point. But as it is, that they in the 60s, when the trains were failing because America was investing in air facilities and in cars, the big, the train companies, the train corporations were the Google, Amazon, of their day at the turn of the 20th century, and are basically just a shadow of themselves by the 1960s. And so, in an attempt to try to keep themselves afloat, they sell the air rights above the station, which had always been underground. The trains had always been underground, to the Madison Square Garden Corporation in the 60s, and try to use that money to keep themselves afloat. Eventually, of course, it doesn't work. But we're left with this sort of disgusting station beneath Madison Square Garden, but right in the heart of Midtown, where more than 500,000 people traverse every day. So more people go through Penn Station every day than go through Kennedy, LaGuardia, and Newark combined. The second most the second most heavily trafficked transit hub in the globe, and it's really New York's front door. And it is just decrepit. And I was reading The Power Broker, the 1975 Pulitzer Prize winning takedown of Robert Moses, who had built a lot of the infrastructure around New York City between the 30s and the 60s, written by Robert Caro. And the sort of remarkable thing that happened to me was that I closed the book at one point when we arrived in New York, and I thought to myself, I had just read the section in which Robert Moses in the 1950s plows through the South Bronx with the Cross Bronx Expressway, despite everyone screaming at him to stop. The mayor is against it. All the locals are against it. Everyone is against it. They plead with him just simply to move the route so that it goes through a park a little bit, or the edge of a park, rather than going through a residential neighborhood. He turns a deaf ear. And it really decimates the South Bronx for the most part. And it occurred to me, why is it that Robert Moses was able to do this bad project despite everyone screaming no? And that, I had been in New York 20 years before this trip into Penn Station, and I'd been reading about plans to redo Penn Station. And here we were 20 years later, and we hadn't made any progress. So why had Moses been able to do bad projects despite everybody saying no? And here was a good project that no one really objected to, but it couldn't get off the ground. And this is 10 years ago, and I didn't have an answer. I didn't know what had happened. I had some notion that maybe the people who owned Madison Square Garden were bad or didn't care, or that Amtrak was underfunded. I had all sorts of notions, but I didn't really understand what had happened. And so the beginning of the book is me trying to answer that question to myself. What had changed between the 50s and the early 2000s so that we went from being able to do big things even if they weren't popular to being unable to doing big things even when they're good?
And you give many more examples in the book, besides Madison Square Garden and Penn Station, of good projects that can't get done. You talk about the state of Massachusetts wanting to run power lines down from Quebec, right?
Yeah.
Tell that story.
Yeah. So in the early days of 2016, the Republican governor of Massachusetts, Charlie Baker, signs a bill designed to green the grid in Massachusetts, which means that he's going to replace fossil fuel burning power generation with clean power. And you can get some of that offshore, between Cape Cod and Martha's Vineyard in Nantucket, which is somewhat controversial, and that's also subject for a different podcast.
You mean the wind? The wind?
Wind turbines along in the Atlantic, exactly.
Okay.
So that was going to be one source of the clean power, but then the other was going to be the hydropower created by dams in Quebec. And Quebec had lots of extra power that they could turn on and wanted to sell to Massachusetts. The problem, of course, is that Massachusetts and Quebec don't border one another. There are 4 states in between: New York, New Hampshire, Vermont, and Maine. And so in order to do this, Massachusetts had to offer to pay and to compensate the people who are in between Quebec and Massachusetts so that they could draw this power down and build a line, a high voltage transmission line from one place to the other. And as it turned out, like initially it looked like it was going to be very easy. They were going to do it through New Hampshire, and then New Hampshire voters caught wind of it and realized that this power line was going to go through the White Mountains. And so they set it aside and rejected it. And at that point, Massachusetts turned to Maine next door. And the history of it is just sort of this remarkable series of just a gauntlet, a series of hurdles that just kept on changing and morphing, where people who didn't want the line through Maine, despite lots of compensation, despite all sorts of benefits to Maine, despite the commerce, the money,
and despite the clear climate benefits of having hydropower as opposed to coal or oil or some other fossil fuel.
Exactly. It would to complete the line would have, by many estimates, would have been the same as taking 700,000 cars off the roads. I mean, that's an enormous benefit to the climate. And ironically, in many cases, it was the environmental community that opposed the project. They didn't want it to go across the Appalachian Trail. They didn't want it to pass by various places where there were beautiful vistas. At one point, there was a complaint that there was an endangered orchid species in the northern woods of Maine, and that if you put the line there were all sorts of, of remarkably, it seemed to me, myopic objections to what was a project that could do enormous good for the environment on the grounds of environmental protection.
I want to take a moment to share a message from Put Families First. It's a coalition of working people, veterans, students, and families who are standing up for the public services that millions of people rely on every day, like Medicaid and public schools. Right now, there's a supposedly big and beautiful bill in the Senate that proposes major cuts to both. For example, it includes $500 billion in Medicaid reductions, which could mean nearly 8 million people, mostly children, could lose access to care. It's a lot of harm, especially for those already navigating tough circumstances. On the education front, nearly 90% of kids in this country attend public schools. Funding cuts, Put Families First points out, could mean larger class sizes, fewer educators, and less support, particularly for students who need it most. Pell Grants could be slashed, and federal programs for students with disabilities might lose critical funding and protections. These aren't just numbers, they represent real consequences for families, students, and communities. Put Families First is working to push back and protect what matters. If you want to learn more or get involved, visit putfamiliesfirst.org. That's putfamilies1st.org. Putfamiliesfirst.org is working on this issue, and they would welcome your support. And you say in your book that progressives are responsible for this state of affairs. So explain what you mean. Well, all these veto points have been given to communities, to various groups, to interest groups, to what. But by the way, before we even get to that, let me just say, when I was reading that section about the power lines in New England, and you were pointing out that there was an identity of interests between the fossil fuel companies who were against the power line and the environmentalists who were also against the power line for different reasons. I thought of that expression that I learned from Russ Roberts, calls it apparently there's a term in economics, which is the Baptists and bootleggers phenomenon. So referring to like prohibition efforts, right? So you get an alliance of Baptists who want prohibition for their own reasons and bootleggers for whom it's beneficial too. So anyway, that is that popped into my head as I was reading that part of your book. But so tell us how your theory is that progressives gave too many vetoes to too many people. So explain what you mean.
So when progressivism was born in the early 20th century, the problem that they were trying to address was that government wasn't effective, that it was hamstrung. and that as a result, various tragedies of the common couldn't be solved. You couldn't figure out a way to get, sort of a good electrical grid through a city. You couldn't build nice parks. You couldn't have a good school system. You couldn't have an adequate sewage network. And so the challenge then was in an age where corporate titans and political bosses sort of were out for their own interests and the public interest got lost. Could you create a bunch of institutions that really were working in the public interest writ large? And that meant taking power as it was in state legislatures and city councils and back rooms and putting it in the hands of big, powerful authorities, blue ribbon commissions, literally public authorities like the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, utility commissions, railroad commissions, big, powerful institutions that were supposed to say, I understand that I've got a lot of people here work beneath me who have their own self-interest, but I'm going to do what's right for everyone. And at the time when progressives were saying this, there was they wanted scientific expertise to be sort of shoehorned into government. Rather than for us to do things for political purposes, we should be using scientific management techniques and do the right thing. And so over the course of most of the 20th century, up to the 60s, that was the progressive approach to governing. How do we collect power into the hands of responsible, generally white, middle-aged men wearing gray suits and fedoras, right? And so, the quintessential example is the Tennessee Valley Authority. The market was not serving these poor farmers in the Upper South. It wasn't profitable to string wires to these poor farms. And so Franklin Roosevelt and this lawyer from Wisconsin named David Lilienthal, who was tasked with running the TVA, hatched this scheme over the course of a very little time to connect, to use public authority, the federal government, to build new dams and to hook up these various hook up the farms to basically remake the Upper South. But by the 1960s and 1970s...
By the way, huge success, and it's still operating today.
Correct. And you see this, NASA is sort of in this same mold, and the Marshall Plan and all sorts of grand machinations, all, for conservatives at the time didn't like it, but nevertheless, many of these were powerful organizations that did big things, and in many cases did them just in ways that were helpful to the public, but that would not have been individually profitable. So the market was not going to step in. You get to the 60s and 70s, and that establishment, it really was an establishment, the people that ran these big institutions.
Wait. Can we back up for a second? Because I think we've collapsed a lot of history here, like an accordion. So you have the progressive movement at the beginning of the 20th century that was really about, taking on the big banks and the big railroads and all of that and regulating them and asserting government power. And also, as you say in your book, delegating more power to people. So at the same time, there were these two competing and contradictory impulses in the progressive movement. One was, you just described, let's take power, and put it in the hands of neutral decision makers who will have vast power and will be able to do what's in the public interest, and there'll be scientific experts and specialists and whatnot. But it was also devolve power. Let's have direct election of senators. Let's have more voting rights for more groups. And so there were contradictory impulses, and you describe these as Hamiltonian and Jeffersonian impulses that you say are part of sort of the warp and woof of the progressive imagination. Although I would say it's just part of the warp and woof of American, brains. I think everybody's got those two tendencies in their minds. But then you shot ahead to the New Deal, which was TVA. So can you just specify
Sure.
a little bit more, the difference between the early progressives in the beginning of the 20th century and those in the New Deal and beyond?
Sure. So progressivism was born in response to these huge, basically railroad corporations that are changing the face of the American economy. And suddenly, the little towns that are along these railroad routes, which had been able to govern themselves for the most part, are now subject to the power of these eastern, powerful railroad corporations. And if they change the price for freight, or if they change the frequency with which a train runs, or if they choose to bypass your town, like, your economic circumstances are totally changed. And the people who live in these little towns don't have any leverage. And so they think to themselves, well, there are essentially two approaches to fixing this problem. One approach is to break up the railroads, right? Make it so that there are more railroads, so that people in little parts of the country are able to reassert their own power over their own fortunes. And that's sort of what Louis Brandeis comes to be famous for. He's averse to bigness. He doesn't like big institutions, whether public or private. And he wants to return the world to the sort of the ideal of the Louisville economy that he grew up in Kentucky. So that's what I call sort of the Jeffersonian impulse within progressivism. You could say that everyone has a sort of a Jeffersonian impulse that they see a big coercive entity, and they want to return power to the people that are being coerced. That is sort of push power down from the railroads and back into the hands of ordinary people. There's a second competing impulse. And that impulse is to say, look, these railroads aren't going away. We all benefit from the fact that there are economies of scale. If it's one railroad that takes your grain from the middle of Ohio into the Boston harbor, so it can be shipped across to Europe, like, that's better than having 18 railroads from point to point and having to exchange your grain each time. So
and also that had different size gauges, which was the case in the early part of the in the 19th century. They had different size railroads. So yeah, it was a mess.
Yeah, it was a mess. And so rather than try to break them up and keep things small, we should just grow government so that it can be an appropriate countervailing power to these huge private interests, and they will advocate for the little people. And so that's taking power as it is in the little towns and pushing it up into these sort of much more monumental authorities. So the first is the Interstate Commerce Corporation, passed basically right at the same time as the Sherman Antitrust Act. These two laws sort of mark the beginning of the progressive era, one of which is to empower the government to break companies up. That's a Jeffersonian impulse. One of which is to create a commission that's going to regulate the railroads. That's a Hamiltonian impulse. And these two ideas are set within progressivism, and people at the time recognize that they are largely at odds with one another. So the way you and I probably learned, the progressive era when we were in middle school or elementary school or high school, is that they give us sort of a litany of things that the progressives were for, and they were for, the income tax, and they were for this, and they were for
wage and hour regulations,
all
and
sorts of things. And in that litany, people will say they were for blue ribbon commissions, and they were for public referenda. Well, those are two totally different ideas about power. One of which is to say everyone should have a voice, and one of which is to say only experts should get to decide. And these two ideas were sort of mushed together in this progressive movement in the early 20th century. And there is in Washington on 19th Street, just north of DuPont Circle, a little brownstone that Walter Lippmann and Felix Frankfurter and a bunch of progressives lived in and debated these very issues at the turn of the 20th century. And it was the House of Truth.
Is it a museum now? Can you go there?
It is not. People live there, but it's a great book by Brad Snyder at Georgetown Law School.
Interesting.
And so these are this is a live issue among progressives at the beginning. And interestingly enough, in the 1912 election, there is a little bit of a personification of this split, where Teddy Roosevelt really is the Hamiltonian candidate, and Woodrow Wilson and he runs as a bull moose, and Woodrow Wilson is a much more Jeffersonian candidate. He's Southern, He's very averse to power. He's very much in Louis Brandeis's influence. And so he ends up elected sort of holding a flag for the Jeffersonian notion that we're going to try to keep things small, and then essentially flips right as he's elected. Wilson is a total Hamiltonian as he governs, to the point that the New Republic, which had endorsed Roosevelt in that first, or the people who were involved in the New Republic had been big Roosevelt supporters in 1912. By 1916, are with Wilson because they believe that he's basically swallowed whole their Hamiltonian agenda. And so Wilson, and that shift where progressivism is a balance of Jeffersonian and Hamiltonianism at the beginning, you see in the Wilson shift what happens to progressivism writ large for the next half century or so, which is that while there is always a Jeffersonian bent, the Hamiltonian impulse really prevails. And so, as we were talking earlier about the Tennessee Valley Authority, so that's the early 1930s. You see in a lot that there are some Jeffersonian elements of the Roosevelt administration, and there are fights within the Roosevelt administration about this. But for the most part, by then, if you are a progressive, you believe that the legislative and judicial branches should get out of the way.
Mm-hmm.
That the federal government, a big, robust federal government, or at the local level, a big, robust mayoralty, or a big, robust state public authority. In all those cases, that these authorities should be given the bandwidth and the authority to do big things, to build dams, to build highways, to build housing projects. That the people who are running are experts, and that to solve America's big problems in the mid 20th century, the solution is empower big government. I mean, this really is, like, to the degree that 3 generations later, conservatives would all be talking about the scourge of big government. Like, this is progressivism in full bloom, embracing big government.
So yes, so there was a huge embrace of big government, but it wasn't just that, was it? I mean, so you give the example of the Empire State Building in New York City, which was built, I think, in 1931, and it took 410 days to build the whole thing, soup to nuts, which is astounding. I mean, it takes that long to just apply for a permit now. And so there's that, and they built the Hoover Dam, but of course, the Empire State Building wasn't built by the state; it was private, and a lot of the things that were able to be built were private enterprise, and the reason they were able to happen is because the progressives had not yet gotten to the point of inhibiting development, but that happened later, starting in the 60s and 70s and 80s, right? So why don't we get to that part? Because that will bring us to and I'm going to quote again from your book, where you talk about how, California is still waiting for high-speed rail that started in 2008, whereas China has built 27,000 miles of high-speed rail since 2008. And when things actually do get done in the United States, like the Second Avenue subway in New York, the cost is $3 billion per mile, or 10 to 20 times as much as in comparable other countries. So how did progressivism get us there?
We have this era where the progressive mantra is empower the establishment. And I think we in current parlance use the term the establishment in a sort of too loosely. Like, it was really a thing. There really was sort of a notion that people like Robert Moses in New York, or Mulholland in LA, every city, you sort of knew who the power was, and that if you could get their ear, it didn't matter who the mayor was. Mayors were voted in and out, but the establishment stayed the same. In Boston, there was a group that met in a bank vault, and they were known as the Vault, right? Like, and every city has a story like this of the establishment. George Marshall, the people that were in Harry Truman's sort of national security cabinet, the Georgetown set. Like, we've got all of these
And
notions.
Eisenhower's cabinet too.
Absolutely. These were establishment figures. And we get to a point in the late 50s where C. Wright Mills writes The Power Elite. And then we get the beat poets and the New Left and the Port Huron Statement. And the underlying zeitgeist of all of this scholarship and activism and thinking is that the establishment, which the progressives themselves had helped to create, is actually bad. That they are the ones that allowed for DDT to be sprayed on crops, so that there were terrible birth defects. That they're the ones that did urban renewal, which destroyed whole neighborhoods around the country. That they're the ones who created the interstate highway system and left us all victims of urban highways that were just polluting cities. That they were responsible for Vietnam, and eventually that they are responsible for Watergate. And so we get to a point where the underlying zeitgeist, which for so long had been in the Wilsonian mold of, in order to fix problems, we need to empower big government to solve things that people can't do for themselves, to the antithesis, which is the very Jeffersonian notion that really government is itself a scourge, and that we need to put guardrails around the Robert Moses and Lyndon Johnsons and Richard Nixons and William Mulhollands of the world, or Richard Daley's of the world, and create inside the system ways that individuals who are disempowered when public authority is being wielded have a way to exert power of their own. And so I just want to stop there, because I just want to, the point is that that's a change of mindset. It's not a single bill. It's not a single movement. It's not just the counterculture. It's not just the environmental movement. It's not just changes in the way that judicial doctrine evolves so that more people have standing to sue. It's not just Ralph Nader and consumerism. It's this sort of a whole cloth.
It's
shift.
all of that.
It's all of those things, but they are all in service to a notion that centralized power is bad, that we need to speak truth to power. And so that when you are a progressive entering office or building policy, your mindset is not how do we get all the mishigas out of the way so the government can just cook. It is how do we install, guardrails so that people aren't making bad decisions, like building the Cross Bronx Expressway across the South Bronx, as Robert Moses had done, or building the Embarcadero Expressway around San Francisco. There are lots and lots of examples that an ordinary progressive would point to suggest that the establishment was making bad decisions, and that what we need to do was to return power to ordinary people. And that becomes, it sort of Jeffersonianism replaces Hamiltonianism as the predominant ideology of progressivism, beginning in the early 70s or the late 60s. Around that period, we sort of have this major shift in the way that progressives think about what needs to be done in the public sphere. And so for 50 years, progressives have been thinking endlessly about how we can better speak truth to power. How can we put in new guardrails to make sure that the environment isn't harmed, to make sure that endangered species aren't forced extinct, to make sure that vital pieces of architecture like the old Penn Station aren't demolished. So we've got preservation laws, that communities that are going to have some sort of big investment have an opportunity to be heard and to have their voices included. And I want to make clear that this is not all on a federal level. It's not at a state level. It's at a local level. It's all those things. It's changes in, as I said earlier, we've expanded standing, as they call it, in the world of the law, so that people can sue when they don't like what's happening with a government decision in a way that David Lilienthal, the Tennessee Valley Authority, would never have had to contend with, let alone Robert Moses. So in all of these cases, the progressive desire has been to make it difficult for government to work, which is an odd thing, because even today, when we think about what does it mean to be liberal or progressive or democratic, It is, I want more government. I want government to do more. I have more faith in the public sector than the private sector. It's all of these things when in fact, for the better part of a half century, progressives themselves have been sort of throwing sand in the gears.
I was looking for it. I couldn't quite find it, but you gave an example somewhere in here about like what a developer or somebody who wanted to build low-income housing or somebody who wanted to build a bridge or somebody who wanted to build anything, that they have to address up to 100 different issues. You just were citing some of them, noise abatement, endangered species, traffic, historical preservation, on and on and on. And so what has happened, according to your account, and I think this isn't even controversial, I think everybody knows this is the case, that there are now all these speed bumps. And so, when Biden was president, there was a big debate within the Biden administration about, how to Trump-proof the country, right? And make it so that people wouldn't want to vote for the populist, that they would be happy with. And Biden felt strongly, I mean, a lot of people think he wasn't doing anything, but in the beginning he definitely was. Biden felt strongly that we had to prove that government can deliver for people. And therefore they will be happy. And they passed these huge pieces of legislation, including a big infrastructure bill, which the Trump people had not been able to do. And yet Biden seemed unaware of the fact that in today's America, because of what you described, because everything takes so damn long, that there's absolutely no way under God's heaven that a piece of legislation passed in 2022 is going to have any effect on the ground that voters could see by the time they're considering who to vote for in 2024. Like nothing would happen. I mean, there were supposed to be all of these charging stations for electric vehicles. There were no, I mean, practically none, in the immediate, right? And it's sort of, there was a failure there to understand that these roadblocks are just an endemic part of the way things run in America now, or fail to run.
Yeah, I think a lot of that is right. I think people are both shocked by how much Biden was able to pass. He was a very effective legislator, and shocked by how little of that actually came to fruition within a period where it would have an effect on whether people had faith in government. I wrote a long piece for the Washington Post on exactly the issue that you just discussed, which is the EV chargers. And what was so striking to me, in this town in Washington, people are so eager to cast blame and accuse people of being incompetent. There was no incompetence there, or there was very little incompetence. The reason that Biden passed in, I think, 2021, the infrastructure bill, which included $7.5 billion to put electric vehicle chargers, to be clear, in the places where electric vehicle chargers were not profitable to build, right? The problem they were trying to solve is that people want to buy an electric vehicle, but they're afraid that on the rare occasion where they drive to grandma's house for Thanksgiving, that they're going to be midway on the drive. And so they buy a gasoline burning car instead. So you need to put a charger in a place where not a lot of people are going to charge their cars, because it's really just there on the rare occasion. So let's just
it's something that the market wouldn't necessarily have provided.
Correct. So it's fixing a market failure, and so then the question is, how do you get it done? How do you make sure that federal subsidies only go to sites that aren't by themselves going to be profitable for an electric vehicle charging, right? So the federal government has no workforce to do this. So they're going to use the state highway departments, which have at least some access to the highways. So the state highway departments, like, they have lots of contractors who pave or who paint or who build guardrails. They've never dealt with an electric vehicle charger. They've never even had to lay wires down, for the most part, right? Except in the places where signs are lit up. So now you've got a situation where the federal government is trying to push money out to state highway departments that in many cases aren't even that eager to make the change to EV chargers. But some cases are. Ohio was actually was maybe the best state for this, and the Governor Mike DeWine, a Republican, was very eager to get the money and figure this out. But then you get to a point where once you need a set of rules to make clear where the federal money can be used so that it's not used to subsidize companies that are already going to make money from the charging. Then you need to get the utilities over which neither the state nor the federal government have any real legislative authority to agree to extend wires to these remotely placed electric vehicle chargers. Biden doesn't have any control over that. The states don't have any control over that. And these utilities are already being bogged down with, sort of people demanding more electricity for AI data centers and whatnot. And who should be first in line? Should it be this remotely, rarely used electric vehicle charging station or this data center that's going to employ lots of people? So by the time Biden leaves, he's gotten this $7.5 billion ready and available for this project. He's contracted with lots of the states. He's trying to get the money out. Everyone is working, I think, generally in the best public interest, but there is no way to get it done in a short time frame. Like just the system doesn't work that way. And this is not. I don't think that's to attack Biden. It's not to attack the people in the transportation department. It's not to attack the states. It's not to attack the utilities. It is that all of these people have their own interests. They're all trying to push things, and the system is fundamentally not meant to work. Now, just contrast that with the Tennessee Valley Authority, which wired up all of these poor farms, whatever it is, 80 years ago. Those were federal workers. They were on the federal workforce. The federal government was paying them directly. There was no need to consider what the environmental implications were of condemning this or putting a pole here or building a dam.
Or bulldozing somebody's farm.
The eminent domain was not an issue. Like all of these things were went without saying, and we had one centralized figure, David Lilienthal, who could basically make all of these decisions on his own. That's a change in our perspective on how government should work. It's not about incompetence. It's not about bad intentions. It's not about even left or right. It's simply a change in the way government works. And I don't think that people have begun to appreciate the degree to which that shift happened, really beginning in the late 60s, early 70s. And now, I mean, you and I could spend a long time trying to think of how would you get these electric vehicle charging stations out faster under the current system, or do you need to change the system itself? Or have much lower expectations?
Well, if I were czar,
yes, if you were czar,
I'd fix it immediately. It would be no problem.
That's right. Exactly right.
No, one way of dealing with such knotty problems that has been suggested by people on the right end of the spectrum is, and this is something that goes back to Napoleon and even earlier, but you offer prizes for a good idea of how to fix something, which can really work. That's how we came up with canning of food. Napoleon offered a prize because he wanted his army to be able to, take its food with it and not have spoilage. And anyway, so that's one possible way out of these knotty problems, Gordian knots. But I'm not suggesting that it's ever really easy. And as you point out, I mean, these things there are so many layers. We do have a federal system with different levels of authority. That makes things complicated now in a way that they didn't used to be. We didn't respect those different authorities in the past. Now we do, and not always to our benefit. And, we are finding that certainly in regard to infrastructure, also arguably in the delivery of medical care and in many areas of our life, we have this kind of grinding, slow system that it lacks agility. It doesn't respond. It doesn't deliver for people. and the whole issue of how expensive housing is. I mean, you have a lot in the book about that, and including, I learned so much from reading this book. It's a really quite a tour de force. But I learned about the role of Prop 13 in California in driving up housing costs, which was interesting because, by referendum, they had limited the tax, the property tax. But anyway, I don't want to get sidetracked on that. It was just an interesting little factoid. But things are very, very expensive. Things are slow. Things are kludgy, to use another poli-sci word. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so what do you propose that we do about it? We need more cost-benefit calculations. We can't just endlessly let people slow everything down to a crawl so that nothing gets done. So how do you go about fixing it?
So this is, again, there is no sort of silver bullet here, but it is for us to think about the sort of the extremes of how government has in the past made choices. At one point, we had David Lilienthal and Robert Moses and these authority establishment figures exercising discretion of their own.
Mm-hmm.
People would come to them, they would choose to listen or they wouldn't, but they would sort of mold the landscape of the United States to their will. They could exercise real discretion. That was their power. They could choose. We ended up not liking that. We thought they made a lot of bad decisions. And so we went to a different model, which was one of procedure. We wanted to have one where everyone would have a voice and in many cases use their voice essentially as a veto. If you didn't listen to me sufficiently, if you weren't properly considerate of my property rights, of my property values, of the interests of disparate communities, of this environmental issue, of this endangered species, of the effect on water levels, let you name it, we would stop your project. No discretion, all procedure, or almost no procedure, all discretion. What you want is some sort of model that incorporates both of these things so that people can't, the degree to which Robert Moses, everyone was screaming at him to move the South Bronx a couple of blocks south so it would be less destructive to the neighborhood of East Tremont. And he didn't care, didn't listen, didn't have to. That's a scourge. We don't want that to happen again.
By the way, though, he did do many good things as well as the bad ones.
Yes, my book is not meant to be a revisionist piece on Robert Moses. A lot of people have tried to do that, and it sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. It is meant, however, to say that the zeitgeist that the Power Broker, that book on Robert Moses, is a part of, which is one which really says that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. That is too simplistic a notion to govern a big country. Someone needs to be able to decide. Someone should have to consider the environmental implications and the disparate impacts on minority communities and what are the, are there houses that should be protected because they are important to the character of a neighborhood and all, right? Are we building on an Indian graveyard? All of these things should be taken into consideration, but they can't all be by themselves enough
deal breakers.
To stop the project. Someone needs to be able to say, I understand that these are the downsides of doing this project. These are the upsides. Here's another alternative. Which one has more downsides and fewer upsides? What can we do to maximize the public good and then be able to move forward? The problem right now is that instead of us having a deliberative discussion where someone considers all the relevant factors and then makes a choice, we have a system where we imagine if all the things are considered, we will come to a decision that has no downside. And that simply isn't reality.
It's not possible, right? And by the way, people who lose out, people whose property is condemned by eminent domain or, various other kinds of losers in these situations, like if it's really important to build a new power station, and you're going to lose your property, people get compensated. I mean, it isn't as if they're complete losers, right? I mean, there is some possibility of compensating people with financially.
If you're taking the property. But I think we should also be honest that, like, if you bought an apartment in San Francisco that looks over the Golden Gate Bridge and someone proposes to build another high rise right in the
in your view, yeah,
like, you're not going to be compensated, right? You could have invested your nest egg in that apartment when you purchased it on the presumption that person is going to be harmed. Now, is the fact that that person has lost value in their property worth preventing whatever it is, 100 families in the new high rise from being able to have a place to live? Probably not. But we should be clear that the problem here is that we don't have a mechanism for making sure that everyone is whole all the time. That part of the privilege of living in American society is that sometimes your own interests have to be set aside for the broader good. And
there's that's
the reality.
And you know what? There's very little of that sort of communal sense anymore, that we might have to make sacrifices for the greater good. It's always, I know my rights, and that is a mindset that maybe needs to change. Let me propose something to you as we finish out this conversation. I've got a governor for you. Okay, his name is Josh Shapiro, and he's the governor of Pennsylvania and has made it part of his brand that he's going to do kind of the things that you, I think, would like. So he is reducing the processing times for occupational licenses. He has he famously took care of a situation where I-95, there was a big accident and a bridge was out, which would have snarled up traffic outside Philadelphia, but it's a huge north-south corridor for business and all kinds of traffic on the East Coast. The initial estimates were that this bridge would be out for months and at tremendous economic cost to the whole region. And I think he had the bridge. He just eliminated on an emergency basis all of the usual permits and requirements and studies and environmental impact statements and everything that normally would prevail. And the bridge was rebuilt in something like 2 weeks, and maybe even less, right? And he's also doing a lot of other things that are an attempt to cut red tape and make things run more smoothly. Are you a fan?
I'm a fan. I would never. We should be clear that Shapiro is clearly on to a great frustration for Democrats and Republicans alike. He's popular in Pennsylvania because rather than getting involved in sort of all the mishigas of national politics, he's sort of focused on the nuts and bolts of government. And I think that is what people want. I wish it were so simple that we could elect some enlightened leaders and have them focus and to put exemptions and categorical exclusions so that you don't have to do this or that thing. There are two things about it. One is, in most cases, you can't just wave away these requirements. There are legislative requirements. The judiciary enforces them. If you haven't done a proper study of this kind of project or that kind of project, the project will be stopped by the fiat of a judge, not by an executive leader. Like, this is what's happened. Is, for all we talk about the imperial presidency in America and our fears of Donald Trump and whatnot, like, the truth is that there are a lot of people who are in positions that would normally be powerful are today deathly frightened of not doing the study correctly because a judge will strike down their project, or not doing the thing that a legislator wants because they will be, a legislator will redline whatever project they want to do, or not doing exactly what the person who's the chief of staff to the governor or to the wants you to do. There are a lot of people who don't feel empowered. And so that it would be great if we could have a Josh Shapiro types running every state, But the notion that one person can just by sheer will of force of will fix this is just like this. These are systematic issues, and they need to be addressed systematically. It's one of the reasons that Doge is going to prove to be a disaster, because the Doge has not reduced any of the actual requirements that federal bureaucracies need to fulfill before they do their jobs. He's just fired the people that would usher those projects along. So they will have done more harm than good in trying to drive efficiency, make a much less efficient government.
Maybe it was a mistake to focus on that I-95 example, because Shapiro has done a lot of other things. It's not just a matter of, the hero governor riding in on his white horse and just, slashing regulations on an emergency basis. I mean, they have had a sort of systematic approach where they are attempting in state government to the degree they can to shorten the wait time for business licenses and permitting reform and all of that kind of thing, so that there is less red tape, and that is a priority. And it seems to me that that's the best we can hope for, is that there would be a groundswell of kind of approval for that kind of reform on a systematic basis in a lot of big states. Of course, Pennsylvania is very important because it's a swing state, but and a big state. But if that kind of thing catches on, it seems to me that would go at least some way down the road you want to travel.
You're absolutely right. And, what's interesting is that if you asked voters, what should politicians be talking about, or what should they be focused on? They're going to say the economy, or they're going to list things that are in the news. When their experience with government in their day-to-day lives is improved, as it looks like Governor Shapiro is aiming to do, their whole impression of government will change. Right? Like, he is getting at an issue that people may not list as the top of their priorities when they're considering who to vote for in the next election, but he's doing things that people can feel. It is the antithesis of the Biden experience, right? It is where he promised to do big things that didn't come. Mm-hmm. Shapiro is focused on the nuts and bolts of what's happening in Pennsylvania, and he has the potential, by doing that, of getting his finger on the thing that is sort of below people's frustration with the public sector.
And though they wouldn't say to a pollster, here's my top priority, if it actually brings results and improves their lives, they will give him the credit.
And which he should have.
Absolutely. All right. Well, Marc Dunkelman, I think that's a good place to end it, on a note of hope. Thanks so much for joining me, and thanks for writing this book.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.